Palo Alto Networks firewall. We're getting into some security policy concepts now. This is really kind of the building blocks, or at least the place that we have the building blocks to get all this stuff together. So security policy, my concepts about it are that I have my firewall right here, and, well, I need rules, okay? I mean, the whole world revolves around security policy. Well, or at least a security policy makes the rockin' world go round. Somewhere in there. There's a balance, I'm sure. Okay? When sessions start, though, everything that we're going to be looking at is the traffic that's coming in and trying to match it for where it is that it's going and what rules are going to be applied in there. Okay? So we'll start things like looking at the source and destination zones, the addresses, those things are determined already. The policy then is checked, or policy rule base anyway, is checked on what we have, on what those pairings happen to be. You have a rule base for each separate zone. Okay? So policy is made up of rule bases, and rule base is specific to each zone pair. Okay, a zone pair, by the way, would be, we have like an untrusted zone and a trust zone, my default ones, whatever zone names you happen to be. That trust and untrust, that is the zone pair that we're talking about. So we have rules involved, or rules that we're going to be looking at, really going to be based on all of that stuff in there. So everything is going to be very specific to that pairing based on where the packet happens to be going. Remember, we route first, okay, so we determine where things are headed, then we'll go ahead and check the policy based on information that we've learned. Well, let's back up a second here, okay, and kind of look at that from our simple concept of what that flow happened to be. Okay, so remember what I had going on, okay? So my initial packet processing, where I'm going to do my lookup, my source zone address, determine all that, determine my destination zone. As I go through here, my pre-checks and all that stuff. Okay, what I'm getting down here for policy really is kind of my end result for things. We'll actually kind of go backwards and talk about some of the other pieces in future nuggets here. But the bottom line is, before I actually process, before I actually send anything out, the policy is where things are going to take place. So the rules that I have, even though they may affect some of these things right here, so we'll kind of do a cross lookup, or really what we do is kind of check everything on there. But all the stuff that I do is going to flow around what that security policy is in my overall point of view of this. So I just wanted to go back and give a little context to where we are in my my parallel processing engine, if we will, but in the processing of our packets as we go through. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this back off. Okay, so kind of getting back to it, it's important to know that policies are always going to be looked at from the top down. Okay, so as I see this, whatever list that I happen to be creating, that's going to be my important rule in there. So first match happens to be used. Now, this is important because it's not going to be most specific match, like we get in other places where we look at from a routing point of view. Okay, it's not going to be like that. For traffic processing here, it's going to be the first match, which means if a rule matches an address as an example, but not the application, the firewall may examine the traffic to further determine things, but may not, depending on what your rule set happens to be in there. So if we have a complete match for something, for all the criteria that you put in, then we're good to go. If you have a second one that may be more specific, or something along those lines, we're never going to get to it. So you always have to watch the order that your policies are put into place on. And we'll talk a bit about that and actually kind of demonstrate it, I guess, or get through the specifics of it in the configuration nugget for this. Now, it is better to define things, by the way, for specific or default ports for any allowed applications. Okay? So kind of a catch, and I suppose there's let me back up a step in here, because there's a number of pieces that are involved in creating a policy. So that kind of makes it very interesting. Each policy entry, pick kind of a different color here, we're going to have source information. Okay, and that information can include zone, or I suppose must include zone, address, and user. Okay, so Could be an individual, could be a group, could be any. So that's kind of an important thing really for any of these in here. We also have a destination, which is going to be the same thing. So zone, address, I'm sorry, no user in that one. Let me erase that part. So user is only going to be on the source side. So zone and address, though, are going to be important for us to have on there. We also get into our application. So our application on here, and we'll spend more details with this. We got an upcoming nugget on app ID, which gets into the very specifics of it. But we have the app itself. So we'll just say app, group, or filter. And lots of ways to describe what an application is. We also have a service, which happens to be some port information. And we can get into other things. We've got what URL category is part of it by default, which gets maybe getting some licensing features, but most importantly afterwards we have our action. So what to do. Permit, deny, other things that we have going along with it. Okay, so every single line of a security policy must have this information. It could be very general, it could be very specific, okay, but that's the bottom rule, is that every rule that we have put in there kind of has to have that stuff. Okay? So that's going to be kind of where we're starting to look, or where we're seeing things for the information that we're going to put down. And again, top-down first match is going to be certainly the way to look at it. So when I define stuff, okay, it's really kind of good in there to put as specific information as you can for things, such as the port information. One, it makes it easier on your firewall, but two, it doesn't allow a lot of extra things to go on. You know, because what happens if we put any? I'll put a different color. All right? What if I decide to put any for my port? Well, I mean, there could be a lot of unwanted or unnecessary connections in there. We do still have other cool things like app ID. Okay, so we'll get to how that works in there. But in the meantime, I've established a connection right here. So I'm establishing a session, TCP session or whatever it's going to be, UDP session, whatever it happens to be. I'm getting traffic in there. I'm allowing things to go through if I permitted it, so I'm also establishing a connection over here on one of my servers up until such time that my application engine then comes back and says, oh, no, wait a minute, this is not cool. So if we can be specific, only allowed on certain ports, that's going to help narrow things down where I don't end up with any extraneous connections here. Okay, we'll call this extra and put a question mark by it. We don't want to have a lot of extra connections that we don't need. Those things take up resources, both on the firewall and on my servers. So even though we may have other features like App ID that can go in and say, that's really not the application you said it was, but good for you, it's nice that we can react to that, but it takes extra time. If there's something bad happening, how long do you want that to go on for? Because in order to recognize anomalous behavior, we have to see behavior first. That means packets have to go through. Okay? So kind of watch how we're balancing this stuff on here. Try, I guess wherever possible, to avoid using any, specifically in the port side of things. But I guess lots of places, the more specific you can be, the better your security policies will be. Another important thing to note is that policies are going to be unidirectional. And I kind of say that with a caveat. We get to the concept because I'm sure, I can see the look on your face, yes. It is a stateful firewall. I got that part. And the whole idea in the stateful firewall is that when a session comes in, we create state, which allows the return traffic. I get that. Yes, that is still true. I'm not denying that at all. But a policy itself is unidirectional for the start of a session. So if you have a session that's going to come in this way, well, that's going to be your zone pairing from trust to untrust. If you have the same application that could be done from the user basis going back out, then you need to have a separate policy or a separate rule entry going from the trust side to the untrust side. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So watch what your sessions are going to actually be. Know your applications and which direction traffic is going to be flowing on there, because that's going to be the, I guess, the drive, the necessity of having multiple rule sets in there. It could be very simple, but it also could not be simple. Okay, so kind of bear in mind what it is that you're going to be transporting. Response traffic in a single session is always going to be allowed because we are, like I said, a stateful firewall. So that stuff hasn't changed. So good rule for this is that everything that I have in my policy, all of this information right here, makes it extremely granular and really increases the potential for some awesome designs. Okay, objects in a security policy, note that these things right here are my objects. That's going to become important right in my next section, so kind of think about that for a second here. But all of these things, with objects plural, okay, all of these things are going to be important for building that awesome security policy and security design for my network. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. Let me clear all this off right here and dive in to that next section, being the building blocks. Okay, so all of these things that we happen to build, so all of those things that I talked about, okay, we can build zones. I have to define them. Those are an object. Addresses. Okay, those are an object in there. Users. Those are also an object. So anything that I'm going to be getting to, and I'll kind of keep going with it as we move along here, but any of those things that I'm going to get to in here are going to be under the object menu of my Palo Alto firewall. So watch that from my GUI design point of view, because that's where I'm going to be looking for things as far as where I build them. The zones are actually set up in the network tab. I was going to put that there. The other ones that we're going to be looking at are, well, I guess in a variety of different places for things. So what I can get under my object tab would be the address itself or address groups, which is just a collection of the addresses that I have. We can get into apps. I'm going to kind of put that off for right now because we have that whole section in the app ID that we'll start looking at. I can do services and service groups as well. So it can give me, again, just a grouping of things in there. Users, I will actually set up under my device, and that's to be able to gather user ID. Now, really, gathering user ID, by the way, and kind of, I know a small segue for it, that can actually gather information from, we'll just put Active Directory, which is probably going to be my primary one. I can do a Novell eDirectory, or I can do MS Exchange. So I've got like a lot of different ways. I'd say Active Directory being the most common, but we'll set things up in there, and I suppose, or Agent, where you can gather information, or CP, which is Captive Portal. So lots of different ways as far as figuring out users. Now what that does is it ties a username to IP address. So I can specify everything. If I did everything static, you know, DHCP is all static for everybody in your organization, that may be very simple to go ahead and configure my addresses, where I can say Joe is address number 1, Bob is address number 2, or whoever I'm going to have in there. Whatever listing, perfectly good to go. Life usually doesn't happen that way, at least after the first, 5 or 10 people that we have. I don't know about you, but as far as administration goes, I really try hard not to have to statically administer every single person in the company. Large organizations, it would never be scalable. So, assuming that we don't do that, and we just use like DHCP or something like that, where things may change, or God forbid, I just don't know everybody, I'm going to have to rely on something else. All of my users will be in something, most likely an Active Directory format. Possibly Novell, possibly Exchange, whatever it is. This, by the way, would just be an LDAP. So we may even be able to use generic LDAP servers, get a little bit different parsing information there, but you kind of get the idea. We have something that we will query to figure out user information based on IP address and see everything in there. We can also have my firewall look at syslog features. Not the most efficient way of doing the mapping, but there's many things that we can do in order to tie user information in there. Okay? But beside that part, right now, looking at our building blocks for things, where we're defining them, that's going to be under our objects menu. Okay? So services and groups I talked about. I may also have custom objects, and this we'll spend more time with in the content ID nugget, because it's really where they're going to come into play. But things like data patterns, let's see, what else do we have? Like spyware and URL categories, and there's a couple other things I'm not remembering at the moment. But mostly from a pattern standpoint, or say /content, to get my details in place for what it is that I'm looking at. Okay? So these are all those things of where it is that I'm going. Now, with my addresses, which is probably going to be my most common thing of what I'm defining, there's lots of different ways that we can look at it. And let me clear these here real quick. Okay, so my address, as I go to define them, okay, so address equals, and it could be set as an IP, so a host. It could be set as a range, so really a network or list, okay? Or it could be set as an FQDN. Okay, remember what that is? Fully qualified domain name. Now, obviously, if I'm doing an FQDN, I need DNS configured. I gotta have that. So there'll be lookups, maybe a little bit of delay in there, but it will update specifics based on that DNS information. So we could have things, and obviously lookup is going to be based on TTL in DNS records. Okay, so how often I have to look it up is going to be based on that. If you have variants in there, or if things change, that may be a useful way to look at it. It may not be. Okay? It really just depends on what your policies are going to be, how you're setting them up, how you're going to be looking at things in there. Now, another thing that I can do, which is, I guess, kind of interesting for being able to grow my network, is in here. I can do dynamic addresses. This is actually a feature that is specific to we'll say greater than or equal to PanOS 6.0. Okay, it's an interesting feature and more advanced. I want to get into a lot of detail here, so we're just going to cover the basics for it. But idea is it's going to be based on tags. Okay, tags are just a generic term for labels, things that I can tie on there. The tags, by the way, are also configured under the Objects tab, so it's kind of the same place for it. But what this allows me to do is use my RESTful API plus VMware. So cool thing is that if I have a VMware, so this server here moves over to a completely different area, and perhaps there's another firewall. Okay? I can have this where it's going to be over a server controlled by this firewall. I'm perfectly cool with it because I don't need to update my policy, because dynamically my address information is going to come in based on these tags that I have. So I can build that into my policy that way. So it's an address object refresh function that we're going to be placing in there. And that, by the way, the RESTful API works every 60 seconds to refresh that information. So cool stuff that we have, but it's all based on those addresses. The address function, mostly for my IP host portion, however we define it in there, or my grouping, my range in there, but my address function, my naming piece in here, is going to be one of those key deals inside my firewall policy configuration for it. Now, as we start growing things like that, you know, especially with my dynamic addresses, every platform has a limit on how many addresses can be used. Okay, and this certainly applies to my dynamic addresses. So if I'm on like a low-end one, so my PA200 or my VM100 model, that is 1,000 entries. If I go up to my larger one, so like a VM3, we'll just call it big because there's a number of them. So my VM300 image, my physical boxes, which would be a 5060 or a 7000 series, any of those are going to allow 100,000, so we'll say 100K entries. So everything that I do in there for my addresses is certainly going to be important, but that may also help scale what device that I'm looking at or how I'm going to build these. My dynamic address groups are going to be applied in my policies just the same way as any address or any address group. So that's kind of a neat thing for it. So I can start building all these things, you know, putting them all in here, building them together, and being able to go in and start to do things in my policies. Now, policy, by the way, remember when we said action, could be permit, could be deny, could be some other things, but those are my two basic ones that I have in there. So I have to decide what it is that I want to do. Given all of this information, I'm going to go ahead and clear this off again here, I can also do things with RBLs. Now, what is an RBL? Yeah, okay. So a remote block list or a remote black hole list, either way that we want to look at that in there. So by definition, and these can be subscription based, okay? So, and subscription by virtue of some may be paid for, some may not be, but somebody updates a dynamic list or a dynamically built list of IP addresses. So we have to have a polling feature in there, we have to have a use for what it's going to be, but it's only going to be for blocking stuff. Okay? So it's a list of IPs, and we see them. I mean, you can use, God, who is it? Sorbs as an example is a big one. There's a lot of them out there for email stuff like spam and spyware and things like that. CYMRU used to do one for networks. You've got lots of different things. There's a place called Malcode. Let's see, they have a weird spelling. So MALC0DE.com. They have a list that they build for simple things for malicious code, what they have. There's the Palo Alto Networks one, worldwide database. So we can get to, let's see, pan wdbl.appspot.com. Okay? And so we got lots of different things that are out there, and you can add your own and do whatever you want in there. But these dynamic block lists allow me to put this into my policy where the firewall can go out and pull this for, you know, where spammers are, or where malicious code comes from, or where, you know, whatever bad things that you're trying to filter happen to be. And somebody else maintains these lists for you. So it'll make your life a lot easier. Just one of the options that we have to play with in there. Getting kind of beyond this, you know, I guess another building block that we can kind of look at is URL categories. Let me clear this again real quick here. So URL categories are, well, pretty much self-explanatory. Okay, they're for URLs. Now, if you've ever used something like, we'll call it WebSense or N2H2 are big companies that do web filtering. If you've ever used any sort of web filtering before, you know that there's a list of, you know, bad or not so good websites that are out there. But to determine what's bad or not so good, because everybody's definition is going to be different on that, we have categories. They could be things like sporting, or some obvious ones like porn. Okay? Don't want to have that in the workplace. You could have things like health. I mean, I know there's gambling. There's tons of categories in there, and those are all going to be defined for you. Now, if you're using one of these URL services, which, by the way, URL dynamically anyway is licensed. Okay, so definitely know that part. However, on my own, if I want to do this manually, I can create my own URL categories. So if you're licensed, you're going to have a populated list already, okay, both of categories and URLs that are tagged to that, and somebody else maintains that, which is cool, because that could be a full-time job for anything in there, okay? But if you want to set up your own categories for things, you are more than welcome to do that. The manual creation can be done without any extra license on there at all. Okay, so that's kind of the cool thing. If you need specific matches, you do URL filtering. But for general groups, we can use this. That'll actually, again, we'll kind of deal with the specifics of this later in the Content ID Nugget, but this gives you an idea of one of the extra building blocks that we might get into. Okay? Beyond this, so kind of stepping a bit back to my policies and profiles part. Okay? So all of these things in here, we have to remember my rules are going to be order specific. Okay? So everything is going to have a rule number, and of course that dictates the position where it's going to be. They can be changed, they can be reordered. I can do it by dragging and dropping within the number column of my policy. I can do it by specifying a number on there. So lots of different ways that we have. But remember that each policy entry needs to have all of that information. Okay? Everything that we have, that rule number will be done dynamically, and then we can move at will. Okay? But that's going to be the important part as far as the order goes. Now, each policy that we have, okay, so everything that we're going to be dealing with, when I look at a policy, when I look at how this thinks or how the device is thinking, it pretty much answers the same questions that we are trained to, I guess as human beings, we kind of vouch for these things, but certainly if you're writing a paper, I suppose that's probably a better way of looking at it. I was a journalism major, so as a journalist, we're trained to do these things. We're supposed to. You've got 6 basic questions that we have to answer for stuff. Okay? So we look at the who, the what, the where, if I can spell that, the when, the how, and the why. Okay, and those are pretty much the questions that we need to have answered for these things. Well, the who could be a user or user group or address group. ADDRESS. Okay, spelling today. The what is where we get into my app info. So I guess we'll call this app and service. And my service port information. The where is where I get into my zone stuff. So my zone and possibly address in here, but mostly my zone is where I'll say that happens to be. The when, well, as soon as my policy, so we'll just say per policy. The how is going to be my action that I'm doing in there. And the why, well, okay, maybe we don't answer the why part. Just one of those things. But otherwise, we had 5 out of the 6, so that's not too bad in the grand scheme of things. Well, that's 82% roughly. So as I'm looking at this, when we get in here, this is what my policy does. So start your planning for things, okay? So when I start looking at what I'm going to do, my building blocks for stuff, I need my addresses. I must have those, okay? Or at least it makes my life a lot easier if I have those. I absolutely must have the zones, okay? But there's really no getting around that for doing anything with my firewall. So address is going to be a big thing for my policies to build. I may need the users. That's kind of a thing that we might get into for it, but not necessarily needing to worry about. I definitely need my apps and services. So even if we're getting generic as far as my port-based information, you need to have that part set up. So my application default, like for SSH, an example would be TCP/22. Or I can use any, which will force it to a more heuristic checks. More application ID stuff that we'll get to. And we'll touch more on that in the next series of nuggets on App ID. But all of these things that we have, start building what these blocks are going to be. Okay, same thing with groups. Okay, if I want to come up with any group in there, go ahead and do that, but start building those things ahead of time, because that will make your policy much easier to put into place at that point. Okay? So I can also, when I get down to it, once I'm complete, so once I have all of my information, all this, you know, who, what, where, when, how, why stuff, well, minus the why, but once I have all that in there, I can go into things and start specifying those policies and the actions. Beyond the actions, okay, that's where we get into the world of profiles. Okay, so interesting thing is a profile can give extra security information, so additional controls, additional protections to be done. Now, profiles only work on policies with allow. Right? So only if I permit that traffic will I then be able to go through and put additional controls or additional guidelines on there via a security profile. Right? So security profiles really kind of neat. Let me clear this here real quick, because I have a number of them. And again, we will cover them in detail. That'll be more my content ID section. But my profiles include different kinds like antivirus, US. Okay. Should be very specific there, you know, worms, viruses, spyware, download, stuff like that. I do have a separate one for anti-spyware. Now, antivirus will cover the downloads of spyware or certain malware things, but the function, okay, so we'll call it behavior of spyware or malware, the accessing the network, stuff like that, will occur in here. I have a separate profile for vulnerabilities, which are some basic exploits, you know, known exploits or things on different operating systems, stuff like that. URL filtering is handled via this. File blocking would be another one. And data filtering. So file blocking is going to be by certain types of files, whereas data filtering will be more like the content of that information. So things like social security numbers, credit cards, really whatever you define as far as the data patterns and stuff like that. These can, of course, be combined into policy groups. Wow, that did not work well. Okay, so that kind of gives me control over building all sorts of different patterns and things that I may want to in there. So I got lots of things that we can do in looking at this. Now, this, of course, brings up the possibility, I suppose, of licenses. Okay. So when I'm starting to look at adding all of these extra profiles and things like that on there, I may have to have a threat prevention license. So threat prevention will do my exploits, my malware, dangerous files list, spyware, botnet, stuff like that. Those are updated on a weekly basis, I believe. It's an automatic file download. Well, can be automatic anyway. We'll talk about that when we get into those details. URL filters would also be a separate license. If I want to do the URL filters through Palo Alto, then I can do that on there. Other things that you might get into, you may see reference to for my licensing, and I'll go ahead and write them up here as being separate. I have a Global Protect, which is really my host-based or my endpoint security, if you will, where I can extend policies down to remote clients. And the other one that I have is Wildfire, which, as I recall, was also a Bad Country song at one point. But anyway, the Wildfire is going to be for more advanced, like polymorphic malware, stuff like that. It gives better interaction with Palo Alto with their intense security team. Great for submissions, real-time help, and stuff like that. So that would be an extra license as well to be able to get into that. Everything that we do on here, you may see these things show up for questions about licenses when you get to your exams and stuff like that. But that pretty much gives you the idea of what it is that we can build, what we can put together, what makes both our policies and profiles capable. Now, one thing I do want to stress out. The most important thing with any security device, okay, so all this stuff that we have right here, everything that it's going to revolve around, policies are great. So policy leads to action, things like that. But it doesn't tell me what's happening. The thing that tells me what's happening are logs. And this is probably the most important single thing to a security engineer. Okay? Everybody may be good at creating policies. Tell me what to do. That's awesome. But the best thing a security engineer can do is actually review those logs. Okay? That would be under the Monitor tab. Okay, we can look at the traffic log, or there's a number of logs in there. We'll show you what they are. But you'll get to see what is or is not occurring. Typically, sessions are logged to completion, so that way things like my time, the amount of time for a session, the bandwidth for a session, and stuff like that will be in there. Denied traffic, by the way, is logged immediately, but everything that's going to be truly happening on the system will be in those logs. So you can filter your view in the logs, so really that kind of make things a little bit more efficient, because there's a ton of logs, at least if your network is busy at all. Logging options can be changed as well. I can do that through my options column, but all sorts of different things that we can do. But bottom line is definitely monitor those logs and use that to adjust my policy, use that to react to what's happening. The stuff that's getting through, is it more or less than what I want? The stuff that's not getting through, is it enough of what I don't want to see, or is there something else that I can do differently? You got to be able to answer all these questions. Security is not a one-time thing. But these security policy concepts, anyway, will get you started for where we're at and how to attack things on a Palo Alto device. So we talked about a lot of the things in here having to do with security policies. Okay, so from a concept standpoint, and we got more specifically into the building blocks, all my address features, my users, my zones, my applications, everything that we have to do, of course, down to actions and all that jazz. But all of those things that we use to build the blocks of a policy in there. And talked about policy versus profile as well. So my extended actions or extended protections, extra things that I may do, at least on permitted traffic that we got to. But the security policy is going to be really everything, like I said, that makes the rockin' world go round here for my firewall. Everything we do in security is tied to this policy. Every action that I have is tied to this policy. So everything that we're doing, all the pieces that we're going to be adding in, all the details that we're going to get through in the subsequent nuggets about app ID, about content ID, about user ID, about decryption, VPN, everything else that we do is all going to tie back into our basic policies. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.
Are you gonna take me home tonight? Oh.